You think you know what kind of person you are? Ask yourself right now, are you patient or quick to anger? Generous or careful with your money? Honest, even when it costs you something? You probably answered fast. Most people do. You carry a small, tidy list of words that you believe describe you in every room you walk into. But here's the strange part. You've broken that list more times than you've kept it, and you barely noticed. Think about the version of you at a family dinner, and the version of you in a job interview, and the version of you arguing with a stranger online at midnight. Are they really the same person, or are you switching quietly into a slightly different character every single time the room changes? For most of the 20th century, psychologists assumed personality worked like a fingerprint, fixed, stable, something you carry with you into every situation the same way you carry your height. Then, in 1968, a psychologist named Walter Mischel published a book that put a crack in that idea that has never fully closed. Mischel gathered up decades of research trying to predict behavior from personality traits alone, honesty, aggression, sociability, and found something uncomfortable. Knowing someone's traits barely predicted what they'd actually do in a given moment. What predicted their behavior far more reliably was the situation they were standing in. This wasn't just theory. Back in 1928, two researchers named Hugh Hartshorne and Mark May ran an enormous study on thousands of school children, testing whether honest kids stayed honest across different settings, a classroom test, a game, an unsupervised task with money on the table. The same children who never cheated in one setting cheated freely in another. Honesty, it turned out, wasn't a trait these kids carried. It was a behavior that showed up or didn't, depending entirely on the room. So which version of those children was the real one? The honest one or the other one? You already know this on some level. You felt yourself become a different person at your parents' house than you are at work. You've watched a calm friend turn sharp and cold the second they were cut off in traffic. None of that surprises you when you see it happen to someone else. What's harder to accept is how much it explains about you. Why does this happen? Why doesn't a stable self just override the room? Because your brain didn't evolve to defend a consistent identity. It evolved to keep you safe and accepted inside whatever group you were standing in. For most of human history, reading the room correctly and adjusting instantly was the difference between staying part of the tribe and being pushed out of it alone. A personality that bent to fit the moment wasn't a flaw. It was survival software. What would you have done differently 40,000 years ago if reading the room wrong meant being left behind alone? Nothing shows this more starkly than what happened in the summer of 1971 in a basement at Stanford University. A psychologist named Philip Zimbardo took a group of ordinary, psychologically healthy young men, assigned half of them to be guards and half to be prisoners in a mock jail, and simply waited. Within days, several of the guards, students with no history of cruelty, were inventing degrading punishments on their own initiative. The experiment had to be shut down early. It wasn't that cruel people had been hiding inside ordinary students all along. It was that the role itself, the situation itself, was doing far more of the work than anyone's underlying personality. Around the same period, a researcher named Stanley Milgram ran a different kind of test. He asked ordinary volunteers to deliver what they believed were increasingly painful electric shocks to another person, simply because a man in a lab coat told them to continue. Most of them did. Not because they were secretly cruel, but because the situation was engineered to make obedience feel like the only reasonable choice. Afterward, almost none of them recognized themselves in what they'd done. A few decades earlier, a psychologist named Muzaffar Sharif ran a quieter but equally telling experiment. He took a group of ordinary 11-year-old boys to a summer camp, split them into two teams, and watched what happened. Within days, boys who had been perfectly friendly a week earlier were raiding each other's cabins and refusing to eat at the same table. Nothing about who these children fundamentally were had changed. What changed was which group the situation had assigned them to and how quickly identity reorganized itself around that group. Does that sound like something contained to a summer camp, or does it sound a little like your office, your group chat, your side of an argument online? That's the part that should unsettle you. Not that strangers in a study behaved badly, that they didn't feel like themselves while doing it. And that feeling is exactly how situational pressure works. It doesn't ask your permission. It doesn't announce itself. It just quietly replaces your usual behavior with whatever the room happens to be rewarding. So where does that leave the story you tell about yourself? It's not a lie exactly. You do have tendencies, a rough average of how you tend to act across most ordinary days. But that average is thinner and more fragile than it feels from the inside. The version of you that you describe to other people is really a highlight reel, edited from your calmest, most typical moments. The rest, the sharper you, the crueler you, the braver you, only shows up when a specific situation pulls it out and then quietly goes back into hiding once the pressure lifts. A sociologist named Irving Goffman had a name for this back in 1959. He compared everyday life to a theater where you're always performing some version of yourself for whichever audience happens to be watching and quietly stepping out of character the moment you're alone. The self you show a room room full of coworkers is a performance. So is the self you show your closest friend. Neither one is fake. They're both real, and neither one is the whole story. This is still happening to you right now today in ways you're not tracking. The version of you that snapped at someone last week wasn't a stranger wearing your face. It was you under a specific pressure, behaving exactly the way that pressure was built to produce. The version of you that stayed unexpectedly calm during a crisis wasn't secretly braver than you thought either. The room simply asked something different of you, and you answered. Which means the most useful question isn't what kind of person you are. It's what kind of situations keep pulling the worst version of you out, and what would happen if you stopped putting yourself in them. That question actually has an answer. The first one, the one about your fixed, essential self, mostly doesn't. You think you know what kind of person you are. What you actually know is what kind of person you've been in the rooms you've happened to stand in so far.